medical school. And I'm also a visiting professor of health psychology at Princeton. And I've spent my entire career studying sugar addiction. I was studying it when people didn't think it was actually a thing. And I know that many people on the call have probably, been struggling with it themselves for many, many years and know, in fact, that it is a real thing. And a lot of the work that we've been doing in my lab has, I think, hopefully helped to give some additional support to the things that individuals are going through who struggle with sugar addiction. We've been able to demonstrate that it is a brain disease. It is a condition of the brain. And so if I may, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have some slides I'd like to walk through, and I just need to have the screen sharing enabled for me because right now it says that the host disabled screen sharing. Let's see if that works.
Should be fine now.
Okay, great. All right. So what I thought we would do today in our time together is I have some slides I kind of wanted to go over, and then I thought we would have a discussion. I'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So as I mentioned, my interest has been in understanding how sugar affects the brain, and we've looked at this through the lens of obesity. Now, I've come to understand from our research studies that certainly sugar addiction is not something that's exclusive to obesity. There's many, many people who struggle with sugar addiction or food addiction and are normal weight or even underweight. And so we got interested in this because the obesity epidemic has been a major public health problem that continues to persist. And it seemed like an interesting phenomenon in that obesity rates were going up as our food environment was changing and as more and more sugar was being injected into it. And so that's where we kind of started in an empirical sense, but we've come to learn and come to do studies that suggest that it is certainly not something that is synonymous with obesity. In fact, it seems to be a symptom associated with obesity, but it's also found among other groups as well. So here's an outline of what I want to talk about. I want to talk a bit about obesity and the problems that it poses, just because that's how we kind of entered into this conversation. I then want to talk about some factors that influence food intake. I also would like to talk about some of the brain systems that regulate the rewarding aspects of food. And then I want to talk a little bit about what is a reward versus an addiction, because that's sort of a slippery slope. You can have things that are rewarding, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be addictive. And you can have things that are addictive. And at some point, anyone who's addicted to something, you would tell you, like, they don't even often find reward or pleasure out of the substance anymore. They're just using it because they're addicted to it. And then I want to talk about food addiction as a measurable construct. And I don't know if we'll have really time to go into the data on minimizing or preventing addiction to sugar, just out of interest of time, but we could certainly touch upon some of that in the Q&A session. So why are so many people overweight or obese, despite the fact that we have all this public health information, this billion-dollar diet industry, all of this real, basically information that's given to us at our fingertips telling us that we should eat a healthy diet? Well, there's lots of things that contribute to it. One is our food accessibility. It's now the case that it's pretty easy to get access to food. Fortunately, thanks to the industrialization, we've been able to refrigerate food. We've been able to get preservatives for our food. And so we no longer have to have this hunter-gatherer method for food. It used to be that we would have to, walk miles to find a berry bush or chase an animal for a day before we would get something to eat. And our environment has changed. We fortunately don't have to do those things anymore, but we still have the same brain. We still have that same hunter-gatherer brain. And so when you get food, when you were a hunter-gatherer, it was really rewarding because you just did all this work to get it. And unfortunately, nowadays, when we get food, it's really rewarding, but we didn't actually work that hard to get it. And our food has changed in the sense that it often is highly processed, highly sugar-added food, and that affects the brain even in a more dramatic way than food would in the past. And so we'll talk about some of that in a minute. And so our food acquisition looks a little bit more like this these days, where you go to a grocery store, you get a month's worth of groceries if you want. And if you don't feel like going to the grocery store, you don't even have to, because you could just open up your phone and get it delivered to your house. And so our food acquisition has really dramatically changed. And that is a factor that has contributed to overeating. Also, portion sizes. If you take a look back at the 1950s, the portion sizes of a typical hamburger at a restaurant, this would be like a fast food restaurant, was relatively small. about 4 ounces. But now, if you look at what our hamburgers look like, it's 3 times the amount. And so the sizes of our portions keep going up and up, but there's no need for that, in the sense that it's not like we need more calories than we did in 1950. If anything, we need less, because we're not getting as much exercise. We're not working in jobs that require a lot of physical activity than compared to 1950s. So if anything, the portion sizes should have gone down, if you ask me, but they've gone up. And as a result, we're consuming more calories. Also, our sedentary lifestyles have gone up. Now, I think that the pandemic has set this into overdrive, in the sense that what was a sedentary lifestyle before became a lot more sedentary when everybody was told to, go to the computer to work and do everything on the computer. We're moving a lot less than we need to be, and that certainly contributes to obesity. And now, if you look at the states in the United States where obesity rates are the highest, they're also the states where physical inactivity is the highest. And so there's a correlation between those two. So I want to point out that obesity is an endpoint with multiple contributing factors. I don't think we'll ever find a cure for obesity, because I don't think there is a singular cause. I think there's multiple things that contribute to it. Sedentary lifestyle, we talked about. There's a genetic vulnerability. People who are born to people who are overweight or obese are going to have a greater genetic risk for becoming overweight or obese themselves. Also, ease of food accessibility, we've talked about. Social norms regarding food have changed. It's socially acceptable to bring food basically everywhere you go. And it's actually looked highly upon if you go to someone's house and bring them something to eat when you come. It's really part of the way in which we interact socially. And that's fine, but again, does that contribute to passive consumption of calories or contribute to social pressures to eat when people just don't want to? There's also stress and endocrine factors, which I won't have time to talk about today. And we talked about portion sizes, and also there are some rare genetic disorders like Prader-Willi syndrome that have obesity as one of their side effects. But what I want to focus on today is this sort of newer one on the side, this whole idea that maybe it's something about the food that we're consuming and the rewarding aspects of it, the pleasurable aspects of it, the hedonic aspect of it, that could be driving us to overeat. And could that be an addiction? So before I talk about addiction, I want to talk about, well, what is a food? And I think this is an important question. And today, when I was teaching my class at Princeton University to my undergraduates, I asked them to define a food. Tell me what a food is. And it was really interesting. We probably sat there for about 10 minutes with all different responses, and we actually couldn't come up with a universally agreed upon definition of food. And I think that's difficult, because we have so many things under this umbrella term of food that nobody really even knows what we're talking about anymore when we say we're having food. So let me give you some examples. So this is a nutrition facts label. You know what this contains, all the information about what you're about to eat. If you look at the ingredients on the bottom, you can see that it tells you it's whole baby carrots. So it's not all that difficult to see that this is a bag of whole baby carrots. But let me show you another food that is still considered under this umbrella term of food. And so this nutrition facts label is very different. Yeah, it has a lot more ingredients. It has ingredients, some of which I don't even know what they are. And I've been studying this for a very, very long time. So there's things like red 40 lake, that's just a dye, and lake 5 yellow, and blue 1 lake. There's also sugar in here in multiple forms, corn syrup, solids. So again, here we have a highly processed product. This is not something that you can, go out and plant in your garden, or, something that you could pluck from a tree. This is a man-made food product, or product that's meant to be a food. And for those of you who were dying to know what it was, it's some sort of breakfasty item that's marketed towards kids, known as mini crisp Pop-Tarts. The point here is we have food, and under that umbrella, we have things like carrots and things like Pop-Tarts. And I think that they're completely different. We shouldn't really have the same word to describe two completely different things. One more quick example, and I bring this up because I've noticed this a lot lately, where people see these buzzwords like dairy-free or gluten-free, and they automatically assume that that means that the food is good for them or healthier than, an alternative. And in many cases that can be true. I think that people who are allergic to dairy or, are trying to reduce their dairy intake for whatever reason, they can benefit from those types of foods and that type of information. But I think it's important to be very careful and look at the labels, because if you take a look at this particular cheese macaroni, mac and cheese, that is made by a popular company that specializes in dairy-free products, it's not really all that healthy. If you take a look at how much is in one container, which is probably, with macaroni and cheese, people don't tend to eat just a little bit of it. They usually eat the majority of the box. You're going to find 55% of the recommended daily amount of saturated fat. Then there's over 70% of the recommended amount of sodium, and over 50% of the recommended amount of carbs. 146 carbohydrates is a lot of carbohydrates. And so this is essentially a sugar and fat and salt bomb that is going to go off in your stomach, but people are drawn to it because it's dairy-free, so it must be healthy. That's not always the case. So I think it's important to underscore that. So what's the big deal about processing? We have to process foods to eat them, like a banana, you have to peel it, a steak, you have to sear it. And processing has been a big part of the way we eat since we've been eating. It's something that we have to do. But I would argue that we've taken it to a whole other level, and you can process food, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay the same. So let me give you some examples. This is a coca leaf. And in parts of the world, in South America, where these leaves grow, I was actually just in Colombia a couple of months ago, and we were in part of the Colombian mountains where these coca leaves were growing wild, and people just pick them off the tree or the bush and chew on them. And it's really not a problem. They actually use them as an appetite suppressant, and they also use them to help alleviate altitude sickness because we're up in the mountains. But if you take this coca leaf and you process it, add some chemicals to it, do a bunch of stuff to it, you can very quickly go from a natural product like coca leaves, which don't really pose any problems for anyone, to cocaine or crack cocaine, which are highly addictive substances. The same could be said for grapes. You could eat grapes as a fruit, but you could have a grape-based product and process it, add a bunch of chemicals to it, and turn it into something that for many people can be problematic and can lead to an addiction. Same could be said for wheat. And then if you think about water and sugarcane, again, alone in nature, these things are relatively harmless. We need water to survive. And sugarcane, in parts of the world where the canes grow, people chew on them like the Colombians chew on the coca leaves. But if you process them, you can turn them into something that's very different and something that a lot of people have a very hard time controlling their intake of. So we have ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are going to contain things like flavors, colors, sweeteners, emulsifiers, and other additives that are put there to make the sensory qualities of the product even better than they could be. So they're enhancing the quality of the sensory stimulation you get from the food. So they're going to make it melt in your mouth a little bit better. They're going to make it smell a little better. They're also in there to disguise the undesirable qualities of the final product. So I haven't tried it, but I'm assuming Red 40 Lake, if you just were to eat it raw, it probably tastes terrible. And so what's the best way to cover that up? Well, add some sugar. And so again, a lot of these ultra-processed foods contain excess amounts of sugar, and in part, sugar is the Band-Aid for all of the disgusting chemicals that are put in the foods to make them look pretty in the package and be able to stay on the shelf for 10 years. When we look at how much of this ultra-processed food we're eating, it's a lot. Some studies suggest that almost 60% of our daily calorie intake is coming from these ultra-processed foods. And again, the content of sugars in ultra-processed foods makes up 21% of those calories. And so that's a lot. That suggests that what we're eating is predominantly processed foods that has added sugars. So why sugar? Well, we started off looking at sugar because we were trying to be careful scientists, and there had been some evidence in the literature that there was a correlation between the amount of sugar people were eating and the rise in the obesity epidemic. And we started off looking at sugar also because there have been so many anecdotal reports, books written by individuals who struggled with a sugar addiction. But we found it interesting that despite this mass of people that really seemed to resonate with this idea that sugar was addictive, there wasn't really any studies on it. And so that's why we decided to start looking at it. Also, recently, within the past couple of years, a paper came out by Frank Yu. He's a epidemiology professor up at Harvard, and he found that intake of consumption of sugar sweetened beverages and artificial sweeteners was actually putting people at greater risk for premature death due to cardiovascular disease. So this is important because this is really the first study to directly link too much sugar to killing you before you need to be dead, what I think is important. And we see that there is this strong link between how sugar can affect our health in the long term. So we didn't know how much sugar was too much sugar until only 2015, when we had the dietary guidelines come out for Americans that recommended no more than 10% of our daily calorie intake come from added sugar. Now, it's a whole nother presentation on why we had information on how much fiber, how much carbohydrate, how much protein, how much all these vitamins we should have each day on labels, but we had no guidance from the government about how much sugar we should take. I'll leave it to you to guess where I would be going with that, but there's a lot of politics involved in it. So we do now have guidelines, no more than 10% of your daily calories coming from sugar. And, depending on who you ask, it's around 10 teaspoons a day. And added sugars don't include things that naturally contain sugar, like milks, vegetables, fruit. With milk, I should say, because they're becoming so popular, it's really only cow's milk that we're talking about that doesn't count. Because if you're drinking oat milk or macadamia nut milk or pistachio nut milk or whatever kind of milk you're drinking, most of the time those contain added sugar. So you have to be very careful to look at the labels or ask if you're in a coffee shop. So interestingly, when we had the new dietary guidelines come out in 2020, and there was a scientific committee put together to decide about whether or not they should change the amount of sugar that's recommended. And the committee decided that it should be reduced to 6% of our daily calories coming from sugar. But at the end of the day, the USDA said that they didn't think there was sufficient evidence to warrant this change. So they decided to stick to the 10%. So I think, again, a little politics were in play here, but it does underscore the fact that maybe 10% is too much. It should be even lower. And when we look at how much is 10% of your daily calories a day, you say that to someone who doesn't monitor their food intake, or they're just not aware. And they might say, oh, I don't know, I guess I'm eating 10% of my calories from sugar or less. But it's interesting when you look at some of the common things that people eat, it's very easy to go over that amount. And we all know that Cinnabons and frappuccinos aren't exactly healthy, but what about yogurt? Yogurt is certainly something that is healthy for many people in some cases. But if you look at this yogurt, it's going to give you about 50% of the daily recommended amount of sugar because of the fruit on the bottom. That fruit's not really fruit. It's just a fruit sugar. It's a compote of fruit that has been boiled down to nothing except the sugar. So here we have an example of how something that appears to be healthful actually is really just loaded with added sugar. And then, there we go. Okay, so I want to talk about the brain and what happens in the brain when we eat, especially when we eat sugar. Now, we have parts of the brain that evolved to reinforce natural behaviors. Our reward system was evolved to reinforce behaviors that we need to engage in to survive as a species. So we need to mate, we need to eat, we need to be with other humans. This is important for the survival of us as a species. Now, drugs of abuse are addictive because they hijack this brain system. They put this brain system into overdrive. And so that's why when people get addicted to things like drugs or alcohol, it can be, so intense and happen relatively quickly because it's overactivating this brain reward system. So there aren't separate brain systems for drugs or food or sex or whatever. There's a brain reward system, and all of these things are operating on the same system. So it makes sense to me that maybe some of these designer foods like the mini crisp Pop-Tarts that were concocted in a laboratory somewhere, maybe they're affecting the brain in a way that's more like a drug and less like what you'd expect to see with a food. And so that's where we started. That's what we were looking to try to understand. So there's two kinds of hunger. And I think that this is important. We've all experienced this. There's the hunger of the kids on the left. These are kids who are hungry because they are weak, because they have not had food. And then there's the hunger on the right. This is more like my kids. These are kids who are hungry, not because they're in caloric need, but because they know they're going to get pleasant sensations from the food they're about to eat. So this has nothing to do with nutrition, has nothing to do with calorie need, and it has everything to do with hedonics and pleasure sensations. So we started to do some experiments in our lab years ago, asking whether or not people could become addicted to sugar the way we become addicted to drugs. And so what we did was, to define addiction, we used a book called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. This is a book that the American Psychiatric Association puts out that catalogs the criteria you need to meet to be diagnosed with having an addiction to substances like drugs or alcohol. So we did a bunch of studies. I'm going to just walk through a few. We started off using our laboratory rats because we couldn't find any people that never had sugar and we needed a control group. And plus we wanted to look at their brains, and the rats are better subjects than humans for that in this case. And so when we were looking at these animals, we found that the rats that had access to sugar solution and their healthy rat food, and they always had access to water, they would come to binge on the sugar when it was offered to them. They were given it 12 hours a day. And what they did was they'd start to binge on it. And they would end up taking more and more over the course of the month-long experiment. And this was evidence of tolerance, in the sense they needed more and more to feel the euphoria they used to get from just having a little bit of it. Also, when we compared them to other control groups, like rats that had 24-hour-a-day access to sugar, or rats that had occasional access to sugar, or even rats that had binge access to healthy food, no sugar, but just healthy food, they didn't show that effect. They acted the same way as they did on the first or second day of the experiment. So there's something about limited daily access to the sugar that caused these rats to binge on it. And when we looked at the brains of these animals, we saw something really interesting. One of the hallmarks of drugs of abuse is that they release a neurochemical in the brain called dopamine every time they're administered. That's happening every time someone smokes a cigarette, does heroin, drinks alcohol, it releases dopamine. That's what it does. Now, we wondered, well, what's going to happen with sugar? Because we know that food can also release dopamine, but it's only really released when it's a novel food. So the first time you ever ate sushi, your brain probably released dopamine because you never had sushi before, and it was a little bit different, and a different taste than what you had been accustomed to. But after you didn't get sick from the sushi and your brain knew it was safe, then you stop releasing dopamine in response to it. So what would happen with sugar? We wondered if it would be more like a drug where it would be released every time, or more like a food where it would maybe be released the first time that the rats drank it, but then after that, it would just go away. And what we found is that it was more like a drug. Every day the rats had sugar, when they binged on it, it released dopamine. And this wasn't happening in the control groups that were also tasting sugar, but not binging on it. So again, there's something about sugar that's causing these animals' brains to act like an addiction, act like they're addicted to a drug. When we take the sugar away, these rats will show signs of withdrawal. They'll show depression. They'll show anxiety. They will show irritability. And we've been able to show this in a variety of different situations, and simply by taking the sugar away when they're used to having it. We've also been interested in understanding how sugar plays a role in combination with other foods, because we know we don't eat sugar in a vacuum, right? We eat it in combination with other tastes like fat. And so this is something that we've been studying. It's known as sensory-specific satiety. If you've ever gone to a buffet restaurant, you would notice that there's so many options. And you might say, oh, wow, they have pasta, I'm going to eat a little bit of that. And like, oh, look, they have chicken, I'm going to have a little bit of that. Or, oh, no, they have dessert over here, I'm going to have a little bit of that. It's called sensory-specific satiety because you could get tired of eating the same food, but if something that's different in a sensory way appears, you might suddenly not be full anymore and you have room for something else. And so we wanted to study this because this is essentially how most of us are eating these days. We're going from cuisine to cuisine to cuisine. There's so many options available. And we wanted to understand what effect this had on the brain. So we took our little lab rats and we gave them basically like a buffet of all the different types of foods that you can imagine, sweetened condensed milk, peanut butter, salami, cheese, marshmallows, whatever. They had a ton of junk food, and then we gave them their healthy food too, but they didn't eat any of it. That's why it's not even on the graph, because they literally let it sit there and did not eat it. And what would you imagine? They got overweight. And then we looked at their brains and we found that if we gave these animals that were obese, DIO, cafeteria diet induced obese, a low dose of amphetamine, which is a drug that can impact the dopamine system, their dopamine system was overactivated by it. And so we're looking at dopamine release here, and you can see in response to amphetamine, the control group that just has the healthy rat food and no junk food, they're releasing some dopamine in response to that challenge with amphetamine. But the rats that have the history of the junk food are releasing a lot more. And then if you look at the bottom, I find this to be the coolest part of this study. When we gave the rats food to eat and looked at the dopamine levels, we saw something really interesting. When we gave them the healthy rat food, they all ate it because they were a little hungry, but it's only the ones that were used to eating just the healthy rat food showed an increase in dopamine levels. The rats that are used to eating junk food, they didn't do anything. Their dopamine levels just stayed the same. They were eating it, but they're not getting any pleasure out of it. It's only when we gave them the cafeteria diet meal back that we started to see their dopamine levels go up. And so this suggests that the brains of these animals are changed by the fact that they're eating a diet rich in sugar. So now healthy food is not rewarding. And this explains why it's so hard for people who are eating sugar their whole life or for many, many years and then want to make a change and eat healthy, but they can't because the brain has changed in a way that makes it extremely difficult. You're not going to find eating a head of broccoli delicious, and it's not going to release dopamine if you have a history of several years worth of abusing sugar, at least at first. It can change over time though. So measuring this clinically has been done couple of years after we started publishing our rat studies. A group up at Yale developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale. And this is for those of you who aren't familiar, it's basically a self-assessment test you can administer where it asks questions about how you feel around food. And it sort of takes those DSM criteria that I talked about that we were looking at for addiction in our rat studies and applies them to food. And so it asks questions like you see listed below. Now, when the study first came out, it was tested in undergraduates. When the survey first came out, it was tested in undergraduates, and they found that about 11% met the criteria for having an addiction to food. And when you look at individuals in the groups that are more at risk, like people who are obese, the numbers go up, 25% in some studies. And if you look at individuals who seem to be in the groups that are at highest risk, those would be individuals who have obesity and comorbid binge eating disorder, then the numbers go up to over 50%. Also, if you look at the brains of people who score high on the Yale Food Addiction Scale, there's also a correlation between neural activity in reward-related brain regions. So you can see that when someone is addicted to a food and then they're shown an image of a food or a milkshake or a taste of a milkshake, it's going to cause more brain activation in these reward-related areas. So we've been interested in understanding which foods are addictive, and we actually collaborated with my lab. We a few years back published this paper with the group that developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale. And we were able to find that the most addictive foods in our study, at least, were pizza, chocolate, chips, cookies, and then ice cream. And the least were cucumbers, carrots, beans, apples, and brown rice. And it's funny because when I was, we published a study and, of course the media picks up on it. We had a couple of reporters reaching out, and pretty much all of them asked the same question, like, well, why did you do this study when we already knew that pizza was addictive? So it's just like colloquially understood that, these foods are addictive, but this study was actually really important because it was the first to show in an empirical study which foods can be addictive. And it also was able to show us what are the factors associated with the food being addictive. And what we found was that the level of processing was the primary factor that predicted whether or not a food would be addictive. So the more highly processed the food, the more likely it is to be addictive. Okay. So the question that I often get from people is it really like a drug addiction? Like, what about the loss of control that people get when they're addicted to a drug? And so my answer to that is that this loss of control does not have to be as extreme as you might typically think. In many ways, this is dictated by social norms. And so while we think about addiction as represented by the individuals in the top picture, it's true that many people, unfortunately, are struggling with addiction that, causes them to have problems with the law, causes them to maybe become homeless, causes them to lose their job. The vast majority of addicts in our society are like the person in the image on the lower part of the slide. Smoking is the leading preventable cause of death in the United States. And the most common addict in our society is a smoker. And this person has a job, they have a family, they have friends, they have little noticeable intoxication. The withdrawal symptoms are really just not life-threatening. But because of the health-related complications, it is still the #1 preventable cause of death in the US. Now, we're seeing smoking rates go down, but we're seeing obesity rates going up. And so my expectation is that in the next 5 to 7 years, we're probably going to see that metabolic diseases, obesity-related diseases are going to overtake smoking as the leading preventable cause of death in the United States. So just to summarize, and then we'll have some time for questions. I see that there's a bunch in the chat that I'll take a look at. So this is a review image that was taken from a colleague's paper who wrote it a few years back that lists all the criteria that you need to meet to be diagnosed with having a substance use disorder or an addiction to drugs and alcohol, according to the American Psychiatric Association. And you can see all of them have been met in both animal models and in human studies when the substance of abuse is sugar. So I think that this supports the idea that sugar is addictive, and it lends a lot more research to the idea that when you eat sugar, it affects your brain and it can cause changes in their brain that make it very difficult for people to control their intake. I want to thank the people who have funded our research. We couldn't have done it without them. I also want to point out, I have a TED Ed video that I made in partnership with TED. It's a 5-minute long animated video that they had their animators put together. It's fabulous. And it really takes what I just took 40 minutes to say and condenses it into 5 minutes. And it's a really, really great way to illustrate what sugar does to your brain. It's called How Sugar Affects Your Brain. So if you just Google my name or go on my website, you'll be able to see it. I'm really proud of it because it has, I think it has like 13 million views, which I know isn't a lot, but for a geeky science video, I think that that's pretty good. And these are some of my books. If anyone's interested in learning more about what I'm writing or thinking about, here's my information. Feel free to reach out. And also on our website, there's links to all of our research papers and just different stories about things that we're working on in terms of nutrition and addiction. So I'm going to stop there. And Steve, how would you like to handle the questions? Do you want me to just read through the chat, or do we want to open it up to the group?
I'm sorry, I was muted. I think most of the chat was pretty much mostly banter. So I think we can just
chat.
Yeah. Well, Anna's my partner, and she was kind of posting links and things like that. So I wonder if we can just open it up to gallery view, and then we'll be able to see everyone and kind of see what kind of questions they have for you. So and I'm happy to watch the chat for you.
Okay, great.
So Jane S has a question. Come on in, Jane.
Okay, so a couple of things. I guess my mom's regime of serving the same thing on Friday, like fish and pot roast on Sunday, was probably a good idea because there wasn't any anticipation and you knew what you were going to eat. So the variety was reduced. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, I don't know if you can see this, but this is something that I had been using to put in my fizzy water that I made in the soda stream. So it's a cold water infusion. Okay, so it's all natural, sugar-free, no artificial sweeteners, but it contains natural flavors. And I was discussing that with a friend, and she said, well, I was reading about that. You can have 1 drop of lemon juice. That's a natural flavor. Then you can have like 50 drops of different kinds of chemicals. So is that true? Do you know if that's true or?
It's a great question. I actually recently received the same question, and I was doing a little bit of research to see what the rules were about natural flavors. And it's kind of murky. It says that it has to be natural in the sense that they're non-chemical, but I mean, how do you define natural? People say stevia is natural, but to me, that's the furthest thing from natural. And so I do think that natural flavors is a bit of a big question mark in terms of what it actually contains. A lot of times, it contains like a proprietary blend of different tastes. to make the product be different than every other product, because otherwise somebody, their competitor could go make the same thing and just sell it for a cheaper price. So the answer is I don't really know, and I don't know if anybody really knows what's in natural flavors.
And they don't have to tell you. Am I correct? The company doesn't have to let you know.
It's considered proprietary.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yes.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Avena.
My friend and co-author, Cindy. How are you?
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Avena, I am just so pleased with your books for family. I'm very grateful that you've written those.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
Really happy and want to encourage Food Addiction Institute to put them on the website there. So I'll talk with them about that. But I have a question with regard to anhedonia. When people get abstinent from whatever their eating has been, and they stop eating these highly palatable foods, sometimes they have that loss of desire about anything, and just are in such despair about life. What's life worth if you can't eat these substances that have been central? So what are the keys to changing that? Some people have it a little bit early in abstinence, and then some people have it ongoing. So have you looked at that? And do rats have anhedonia?
Yes, they do. Yes. Great question. We've done a significant amount of research looking at that anhedonia piece, and it's a symptom of withdrawal. And it happens during withdrawal from drugs and alcohol too. People will also report anhedonia to the point where they often need to be medicated for depression. And so it is not something that is uncommon. In fact, it's very common to be seen, especially when people have a long history of abusing substances and then abruptly stop. They do go through this withdrawal period that can lead to depression, lead to this anhedonia. And if you think about it, I almost look at it like it's the yin and the yang, right? If you had, your brain on overdrive for all these years, getting pleasure from the sugar, now your brain has to balance it back out. And so if you're going to be low for a while until you can get to that equilibrium point. And so in terms of what people can do, certainly it's a real situation. And so if you're feeling blue, it's very important to talk to a doctor about it, because it could be serious and it can lead to major depression for some individuals who are sensitive to it. For most people, it's a waiting game. It rectifies itself. It's just a matter of waiting. And I know that can be tough, especially when you're not feeling good and you want to feel good. But really, once your brain kind of reestablishes its baseline for your mood, then you will feel better. And if anything, you're going to feel better than you did, because you're not going to have those ups and downs when you're eating sugar and then you're crashing. And then you're, oh my gosh, I'm starving. It's my blood sugar. Is it, there's all these, it's complicated. When you're not eating sugar, it's not complicated because you're not eating sugar. And so your mood is much more even keeled. And I've seen this so many times and people report it often. So it's really just a matter of waiting, and, it'll happen.
Thanks, Cindy. All right, we'll go to Anna, then we'll go to Karen, and then we have a couple questions in the chat that we'll tend to.
So, hi, nice to see you again. I was in Bitten's first English speaking class and you came in then, and I love your work as well. And I've seen your video a million times, and I did put it in the chat.
Oh, good. Thank you.
My question is there any brain research or science around denial? Because addiction is the only disease. And I always think it's funny because, I used to be a nurse, and the brain is like such an important organ in the body. And I think we forget that it's an organ, and we have that shame and guilt and all of that around loss of control. Why can't I do this thing? What's wrong with me? Is there some science around denial, or has there been any research around denial, and what gets us so entrenched into that it's like, they say addiction is the only disease that we deny that we have?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think people do deny that they have it, but I think that they probably go through moments where they're not denying that they have it. And I think that, it just takes a lot longer for someone to admit that they have it. And I think one of the issues we see is that, addiction looks different for everybody. It's not going to be, a diabetes diagnosis where you're over a certain level on your A1C and you're a diabetic. That's just how they define it.
Mm-hmm.
There's really a lot of shades of gray when it comes to addiction. And the other part of it is people can be fully functioning. You could have a perfectly normal BMI. You can have a family that you take great care of. You can have a wonderful job, lots of friends, but you could have an addiction to sugar or alcohol or anything. And so people can get really good at hiding it. And that, I think, reinforces their denial or their ability to deny it, because they might talk to themselves and say, well, maybe there is nothing wrong with me because I look just as good as the person next to me and my life is just as together as the person next to me. So I think that's what feeds into it. We don't really have like a clear-cut definition of addiction. It looks different on everybody. And I think that many people are just really good at being addicted and hiding it.
Right. So it's a little bit like the stigma as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
Karen.
Hi. Fascinating. Your talk. Thanks so much. And
You're welcome.
I'm supporting Cynthia in drafting a proposal to the DSM to get food addiction accepted as a substance use disorder on behalf of the Food Addiction Institute. So it would be really remiss, having read your actual research, really remiss of me to not take the opportunity to ask you, is there anything in the argument, because here, we are food addicts, we are sugar addicts, we understand this. What would you recommend should be the slant of the argument to get it through to the DSM that this is an actual thing? We've got a huge body of evidence now, but are there any tips on, particular things that you think might help us get through to them?
Yeah, so Dave Evans was working on this as well, right? Yes, so he had corresponded with me about it and we kind of exchanged some ideas. I got to be honest, it's political at this point. There's a lot of lobbying that goes on from the food industry to, make sure that these things don't always happen. I mean, there's a reason why the recommended amount of sugar wasn't dropped to 6% when a whole panel of experts that were hand selected to assess that question all suggested it should be, but then it suddenly isn't. The recommendation isn't followed. And so, I think that the argument is really the research papers. The argument is the cost to public health.
Yeah.
Outside of, just, a lot of people become addicted to sugar. Well, guess what? You become addicted to sugar, you can develop obesity, hypertension, diabetes, all of the things that cost a lot of money and are burdens on our society from, the standpoint of our healthcare system. I think those are some arguments to put forward. And, I think when you think about it outside of just being addicted to sugar, what is the damage outside of the immediate effects that it has on individuals who have it?
Great, thank you.
Okay.
It's scary. It's really scary. What we're up against. Thank you for the question, Karen. I know that Tracy's got a fighter in you, and rather Cindy's got a fighter in you, which is awesome. So here's a question from someone, our friend Tracy from Australia. She can't speak at the moment. She said, what are your findings, knowledge in terms of length of time to heal the brain in terms of addiction? She said that she's heard from other groups that it could take 1 month of abstinence for each year the addiction was present.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually, I did a segment. I do a lot of TV segments because I don't know why. A long time ago, somebody said I should do TV segments. And now a lot of the reporters come to me and ask for opinions and whatnot. So they're a lot of fun. But anyway, I just did one for the Today Show. I'll see if I can find the clip and I'll send it to Dave. And it was all about habits and how long does it take to break a bad habit. And so it didn't necessarily specifically just apply to food addiction, but it does apply because we know a lot about the research on habit formation. And this whole idea about the 21 days or 31 days, I really think that that's kind of a construction of the industry. You know, it's really a matter of sticking to these small changes in your behavior in order for us to get our habits to change. And I actually don't think that it's something that happens like overnight where you suddenly flip a switch and you're no longer addicted to sugar. I think that the further you go from overeating sugar, the easier it gets to manage. And of course, you're going to have periods where you're tempted or you have a, you know, hormonal influence, or you're going to have emotional influence that's going to lead you to maybe want to, you know, give into some of your cravings. But in terms of the neurochemistry, it's really about a temporal difference in the amount of time between when you eat the stuff and when you don't eat it. And so the longer you go between then, the easier it's going to get. So in terms of a number, I mean, I'd say 2 or 3 months is more like what I've seen in terms of people I've worked with, where they finally feel like they are back in control and they don't have to be, you know, as mindful of all of the things that they're eating.
That's more about the food, or the food's controlling you, as opposed to like the brain healing, right?
Yeah, so exactly. And, you know, your brain starts healing instantly. I mean, our brains are constantly changing and constantly malleable. And so I think, you know, the thing about the brain is it's not like if you cut your skin or break an arm where it's going to say, oh, well, it'll heal in 6 weeks and you'll never even notice the difference. The brain's different. Our brains are constantly changing and just basically adapting to our environment and our situation. And so, you know, our brains are, I would say for addiction, I'd go so far to say this, and I don't say this to discourage anybody, but this is the truth, that our brains are never 100% healed from being addicted, because you're always going to be slightly at greater risk for wanting to get that substance than someone who never had that substance. Think about people who smoke cigarettes. I know people who quit smoking 50 years ago, but every once in a while, they'll just say, you know what, I'm craving a cigarette. I'm not going to have one. I'm not interested in having one, but I have that craving. And that's because these memories live on in our brains. And so we just need to be mindful of them. But I think that they're going to persist.
Thank you. Awesome. Back to you, Cindy.
Wonderful. Thank you. Another question related to the DSM, et cetera. One of the things that we're responsible for doing is to separate out that which is binge eating disorder from that which is food addiction, which those of us who have food addiction also many times have binge eating disorder as well, and we recognize it in ourselves. But how in the research they're showing overlaps with other eating disorders, specifically with binge eating, and saying that binge eating disorder, that food addiction may actually be a subset of binge eating disorder and a more serious one. Whereas I would describe it as food addiction is a more serious and binge eating is in addition to. Would that be true?
I think that, you know, my personal take on it is that I think food addiction is a symptom that can be found in a variety of other eating disorders, like obesity, like binge eating disorder. We even have some data that we published at a conference where we found evidence of food addiction among women who had anorexia nervosa. And so I think that, you know, you can have comorbid conditions. And I think that when it comes to food addiction, it's going to be very hard to parse apart what's binge eating, what aspect of their condition is binge eating or food addiction. I mean, that's like saying, you know, someone who has cardiovascular disease, oh, well, what percentage of it is due to their genetics versus their diet versus stress? I mean, you can't like count that up or quantify that in any way. So I think that, you know, it's really a matter of the fact that these are overlapping phenomena, and, you know, depending on the individual, they may experience more or less of it, and they may experience, in many cases, comorbid conditions that are also have food addiction.
Thank you.
And we'll go to Anna, and then I'm gonna go to one of the questions in the chat.
Well, I just have a question that just Cynthia made me think of, and that is, we're taught by Bitten, and I believe that, the substance has to come first for the brain to be rewired. Would you say that that's true, or, rather than the behavior? So like the binge eating, I would have to be binge eating on sugar for a substance to change my brain and change that reward center, so that addiction has no underlying cause. It's the substance that causes the rewiring. Is that correct?
I would agree with that, because if it was just and this is why I get mad at other scientists that say stuff like, oh, it's eating addiction, it's not food addiction. That aggravates me, because if it was eating addiction, then why aren't people addicted to eating broccoli? It's not
I love you. That's all I have to say. We love you.
But thank you. I love you guys too, but it's very frustrating. And I have to do these ridiculous debates with these scientists about this. And I don't mind, because that's part of the scientific process. So I'm willing to put my time in, but it's just ridiculous, like, to suggest that it's the act of eating that's addictive, because if that was the case, then we could just eat cardboard and that would satisfy, people would be walking around addicted to that, but they're not. They're addicted to certain types of foods. And, it's a very narrow subset of foods that people are addicted to. They're highly processed and they're loaded with sugar. And so to me, it's about changing the substance. And yeah, if you're a binge eater, if you could replace your sugar with broccoli, great, go for it. Guarantee you're not going to be binge eating for very long, because that's not going to release dopamine in your brain, and it's not going to do what the sugar was doing to you. So it is very much about the substance and not about the behavior. But if you change the substance, you will quickly be able to change your behavior.
And that brings up the whole stevia thing and making keto treats and all of that stuff, because you certainly can binge on kind of like the non-drug foods,
Yeah, I don't know if I even have time.
You create those things.
Yeah. I don't know if I have to go in a few minutes because I have to take my daughter somewhere. But, I actually was recently found out, and I didn't know this. I thought everybody thought stevia tasted this way. When I eat stevia, it tastes bitter to me. It tastes like a chemical. And somebody recently told me, and I have to look into this to see if it's how true it is, but they seemed like they knew what they were talking about, that it's basically an allergic reaction, because a stevia plant is somehow related to the ragweed plant. And I'm very allergic to ragweed. I get awful seasonal allergies. And apparently that's why some people eat stevia and it tastes bitter to them. So I don't know, but in any case, when it comes to these alternative sweeteners, I'm not a fan. I think that we need to minimize our sweetness. It's not about subbing out some, other sugar that's going to have fewer calories, or it's more natural, or whatever they want to say. I really think it's about like reducing the sweetness of our diet, because that's what we have to do.
There was a question in the chat, which is like, I think a buzzer beater question. It would take you 6 seconds to answer. And there was a question, what were your thoughts on monk fruit, which I think you pretty much clearly just stated. But
yeah, I think there's a place for monk fruit. I think, I'm not saying I don't think people should use it. I think that for some individuals, it can be a crutch. It can get you off of actual sugar, and it can be a step down the path. But, when I talk to people and they say, oh, I went sugar-free, all I eat is monk fruit now, I say, well, that's not the end goal, and you're not going to correct the addiction, because your brain is still going to be releasing dopamine in response to monk fruit and to these other sweeteners. And so I don't want to give it a complete bad rap in the sense that, I don't think it's good, but I do think that the ultimate goal should be to try to reduce how sweet our diet is. That's going to be the thing that's going to make it easier to break the addiction and to get off of these things.
Well, thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts for coming and spending some time with us. We certainly learned a lot, and we love your perspective on pretty much everything. So.
Oh, well, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm sorry I have to run, but it was great to see you all. And thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye. So long.